Tasha had been looking forward to this day all week. It was a Friday, and she couldn't wait for the weekend to begin. She got up early, picked out her favorite uniform, and carefully put it on. Tasha's uniform was important to her. It made her feel confident and ready for the school day. She adjusted her skirt and smiled at her reflection in the mirror before heading to the kitchen for breakfast. Her mom, Sandra, was already up and making pancakes. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said with a smile. Tasha sat down, happily chatting with her mom as they ate together. Everything felt normal, like it always did on school mornings. Tasha grabbed her backpack, said goodbye to her mom, and headed out to catch the school bus. She was excited to meet her friends and talk about the plans for the weekend. The bus ride was full of laughter, and Tasha felt like she was part of a fun group. The whole morning had been just like any other. When Tasha arrived at school, she walked into the building and headed straight to her homeroom. She said hello to the teacher, Mr. Turner, and sat down at her desk. Mr. Turner was a nice teacher, but sometimes he could be a little too focused on the rules. He always made sure the students followed the dress code, which was strict but clear. Today, however, Tasha was about to learn that Mr. Turner's attention to detail might not always work in her favor. As soon as Mr. Turner saw Tasha sitting at her desk, he paused for a moment, looking at her with a puzzled expression. He walked over to her and said, "Tasha, you know the rules about uniforms, right?" Tasha blinked, confused. She looked down at her outfit. She was wearing the same uniform she always wore. "I think there's a problem with your pants," Mr. Turner continued, his voice stern. Tasha felt a wave of confusion. She was sure she had put on the correct pants. She checked her uniform every morning to make sure everything was perfect. "What's wrong with my pants?" she asked, her voice soft but worried. Mr. Turner raised an eyebrow. "They're the wrong color," he said. "You need to go home and change into the right pair." Tasha felt her heart sink. She was embarrassed and didn't understand what was happening. She looked around at the other students, who were now starting to pay attention to her. Her face turned red. "But Mr. Turner, I didn't know they were wrong," she tried to explain. "Please, I don't think I need to go home." Mr. Turner, however, was insistent. "You need to follow the rules," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Tasha looked at him, unsure of what to do. "Go home and change, Tasha," he repeated, a little more forcefully this time. Tasha stood up, trying to hold back the tears. She grabbed her backpack and walked out of the classroom, feeling the eyes of her classmates on her. As she stepped outside into the cool air, she felt small and humiliated. She had done nothing wrong, but now she was being treated like she had made a huge mistake. The walk home felt longer than usual. Every step felt like a reminder that something wasn't right. Tasha wondered if she would be able to explain things to her mom and if she would be understood. She felt frustrated and defeated, but most of all, she just wanted to change back into her uniform and forget the whole thing ever happened. Tasha walked home with her head down, her backpack bouncing lightly on her back. The sun was out, but it didn't seem to warm her spirits. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, and her thoughts were racing. She couldn't stop replaying what had happened at school. Why had Mr. Turner sent her home? She had no idea what she had done wrong. She had followed the rules, worn the uniform just like everyone else. But now she was walking alone, away from her friends, away from the school, all because of a mistake she didn't even understand. When she reached her house, Tasha stood in front of the door for a moment, hesitating. She wasn't sure what to say to her mom. Sandra was always so supportive, but she could tell her mother wouldn't be happy to hear about this. Tasha took a deep breath and opened the door, the familiar smell of dinner drifting in from the kitchen. Sandra looked up, smiling warmly, but when she saw the look on Tasha's face, her smile faded. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Sandra asked, her voice filled with concern. Tasha dropped her backpack onto the couch and slowly took off her shoes, still feeling the weight of the embarrassment. "Mom, something happened at school," she said quietly. "Mr. Turner, he sent me home." Sandra's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Sent you home, she repeated, walking over to her daughter. Why? What happened? Tasha took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. She quickly explained how Mr. Turner had pointed out that her pants were the wrong color and insisted she go home to change. She told her mom how confused and upset she had been, not understanding why she was being singled out. Sandra listened quietly, but her expression grew more serious with each word. She could feel the frustration building inside her daughter. After Tasha finished speaking, Sandra put a comforting hand on her shoulder. You did nothing wrong, sweetheart. You followed the rules, right? Tasha nodded, trying to hold back her tears. Then this is something we need to fix, Sandra said firmly. Let's go to the school tomorrow and talk to the principal. You shouldn't be treated like that. Tasha felt a little bit of relief. Her mom always knew how to make her feel better, even in the worst of situations. Sandra didn't like to let things slide, especially when it came to her children being treated unfairly. She knew her rights, and she would make sure that Tasha's dignity was respected. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Sandra quietly made a plan in her mind. She would take this matter seriously. No one, especially not a teacher, should make a student feel less than they were. She would call the school in the morning, and she wouldn't let it go until Tasha's name was cleared and the issue was resolved. Tasha ate her dinner quietly, feeling a little better knowing her mom had her back. But the next day, she still wasn't sure how everything would turn out. Would Mr. Turner apologize? Would the school take her side? As she got ready for bed, Tasha hoped things would get better. She just wanted everything to go back to normal. But in the back of her mind, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let anyone treat her this way again. The next morning, Sandra wasted no time. As soon as Tasha had eaten breakfast and left for school, she picked up the phone and dialed the school's number. She could feel the tension building in her chest as the phone rang, but she stayed calm. She knew this was important. After a few rings, the receptionist answered. Sandra politely explained the situation and asked to speak to the principal, Mrs. Roberts. Mrs. Roberts was available, and Sandra didn't waste a moment getting straight to the point. She calmly explained what had happened the day before, how Tasha had been sent home because of an issue with her uniform pants. Sandra expressed her concern about how the situation was handled, saying that her daughter had been humiliated without cause. She was firm but respectful, wanting to make sure her message was clear. I understand your frustration, Ms. Reynolds, Mrs. Roberts said on the other end of the line. Let me look into this immediately, and we'll get back to you. We want to make sure that everything is handled fairly. Sandra thanked her, but she wasn't completely satisfied. She knew things wouldn't just fix themselves, so she decided to take a proactive approach. She wanted to meet with the principal in person to discuss the situation. She also decided that she would speak with Mr. Turner, the teacher who had sent Tasha home. This wasn't just about the uniform. It was about making sure her daughter felt respected at school. By the time Tasha returned home that afternoon, Sandra had already arranged a meeting with Mrs. Roberts. Tasha walked in, noticing the serious expression on her mother's face. What's going on, Mom? Tasha asked, feeling a little anxious. Sandra looked at her daughter, giving her a warm but determined smile. We're going to the school tomorrow, she said calmly. We're going to make sure this is handled properly. Tasha was both relieved and nervous. She trusted her mom completely, but she wasn't sure what to expect. She'd never had to deal with something like this before, and she didn't know if she was ready for the confrontation. But as her mom explained the plan, Tasha started to feel a little more confident. Sandra wasn't the kind of person to back down, and that gave Tasha hope. The next morning, they arrived at the school early. Mrs. Roberts greeted them with a polite smile, but also with a sense of urgency, knowing that the situation needed to be resolved quickly. She led them into her office, where they could talk privately. Sandra started by explaining how Tasha had felt embarrassed and singled out by Mr. Turner's actions. She emphasized that this wasn't just about a uniform error, but about how her daughter had been treated. My daughter is a smart, hard-working student. She should never have been made to feel like she did something wrong when she didn't, Sandra said. Mrs. Roberts nodded, taking notes as she listened carefully. I understand, and I'm truly sorry that Tasha went through this, she said. We're going to get to the bottom of this. The meeting went on for a while, with Sandra and Mrs. Roberts discussing the school's policies and how they could prevent this kind of misunderstanding in the future. Sandra felt reassured by Mrs. Roberts' willingness to listen and act. She knew this wasn't the end of the matter, but it was a start. After the meeting, Sandra and Tasha left the school feeling a little lighter. They still didn't know exactly how things would turn out, but they knew they had taken the first step in standing up for what was right. Tasha felt proud of her mom for taking charge, and Sandra was glad to have made her daughter feel supported. They walked home together, ready for whatever came next. The following morning, Sandra and Tasha arrived at the school early, their nerves mixed with hope. Sandra had made it clear to the principal that she wanted to meet with Mr. Turner, the teacher who had sent Tasha home the day before. She believed that speaking with him directly was the best way to resolve the situation. Tasha felt a little nervous, but also knew that she wasn't alone. Her mom had already set the tone, and Tasha trusted that Sandra would do whatever it took to make things right. As they entered the principal's office, Mrs. Roberts was already waiting for them. She greeted them both kindly, but with a serious expression. I'm glad you could both make it this morning. I've already spoken with Mr. Turner, and he's agreed to meet with us, Mrs. Roberts said. Her voice was calm but firm, and Tasha could see that she was taking this seriously. Sandra gave a small nod and said, Thank you, Mrs. Roberts. We just want to make sure this doesn't happen again. It's not just about the pants. It's about how Tasha was treated. Tasha couldn't help but feel the weight of her mom's words. It wasn't just about the mistake. It was about feeling disrespected in front of everyone. She hadn't realized how much it had bothered her until she heard her mom put it into words. A few minutes later, Mr. Turner walked into the office. He seemed uncomfortable, his hands slightly trembling as he shook hands with Sandra and Tasha. Tasha couldn't read his face, but she could tell that something had changed. He was no longer the confident teacher he had been the day before. Mr. Turner, thank you for meeting with us, Sandra began. We want to discuss the situation that happened yesterday with Tasha. I understand you thought there was an issue with her uniform, but what I don't understand is why she was sent home instead of being given a chance to explain herself. Mr. Turner nodded, his face slightly reddening. I see now that I acted too quickly, he admitted. I didn't think about the situation thoroughly. I thought she was in violation of the uniform policy, but I didn't stop to consider how embarrassing it might be for her to be sent home like that. He paused and looked at Tasha. I'm really sorry, Tasha. That was a mistake on my part. Tasha stared at him for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She didn't expect an apology, but hearing one made her feel a little better. She nodded, but she didn't speak. The truth was, she had been hurt by his actions, and it would take time to completely forgive him. But she appreciated the honesty. Sandra looked at Mr. Turner, still serious but calmer now that he had acknowledged his mistake. It's not just about an apology, Mr. Turner. It's about how we make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again, especially to other students. It's important to treat every student with respect and dignity, and I don't feel it happened here. Mrs. Roberts stepped in, her voice calm but firm. We'll be taking steps to ensure that all staff are reminded of how to handle these situations in a more understanding and compassionate way. This will be addressed with Mr. Turner, and we'll also be holding a meeting with the teachers to discuss cultural sensitivity and how to avoid situations like this in the future. Sandra nodded, satisfied with the direction the conversation was going. Thank you, Mrs. Roberts. That's all we ask for, fair treatment and a commitment to making things better. With that, the meeting came to an end. Mr. Turner apologized once more, and Tasha, though still hurt, felt a small sense of relief. The situation wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. As they left the school, Sandra put her arm around Tasha's shoulders and smiled. "I'm proud of you, sweetie," she said. "You stood up for yourself, and we made sure your voice was heard." Tasha smiled back, feeling a little lighter. It had been a tough couple of days, but she was learning that standing up for what was right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. She was grateful for her mom's support and knew that, no matter what, they would face things together. After the meeting, Mr. Turner couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. As he walked back to his classroom, he thought about how the situation had unfolded. He had been so sure of himself when he sent Tasha home, thinking it was just a simple uniform mistake. But now, with the weight of Sandra's words and Tasha's hurt expression still lingering in his mind, he began to second-guess everything. He had always prided himself on being a teacher who followed the rules, someone who upheld the standards. But in that moment, it became clear to him that the rules weren't enough. It wasn't just about enforcing policies, it was about how those policies were carried out, how they impacted the students, how they made them feel. He realized that he had acted hastily, without considering the bigger picture. The thought of Tasha walking home, humiliated and confused, gnawed at him. Mr. Turner's stomach tightened as he imagined what it must have been like for her. An innocent mistake, yet the consequences were far more painful than he had anticipated. He could still see the look on Sandra's face when she explained how upset Tasha had been. It was a look of frustration, but also of determination. He had no idea who Tasha's father was at the time, but hearing about him, knowing that he had connections to the school and the community, only added pressure to his regret. When he finally returned to his classroom, Mr. Turner sat at his desk, staring at the empty seat where Tasha had been sitting earlier. He began to wonder what he could have done differently, if he had listened more carefully, if he had asked questions instead of jumping to conclusions. But it was too late to change the past, and he knew that his actions had consequences. Mr. Turner knew he had to face the situation head-on, not just for his own sake, but for Tasha's as well. He couldn't hide from the mistake he had made. He had to apologize, but more than that, he had to change. He had to be a better teacher, one who took the time to understand his students and treat them with the respect they deserved. He picked up the phone and dialed Mrs. Roberts. "I think it's time I spoke to Tasha," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I need to make things right." Mrs. Roberts agreed, and they set up a time for Mr. Turner to meet with Tasha again. As Mr. Turner sat there, waiting for the meeting, he realized that this experience was an important lesson, not just for Tasha, but for him as well. He had learned the hard way that respect and understanding were just as important as following rules, and he hoped that his actions from this point on would reflect that lesson. The day of the follow-up meeting arrived, and Tasha felt a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. She had already spoken to her mom about it, and she knew that this would be an important step in clearing the air with Mr. Turner. She had never expected him to apologize in the first place, but now that the opportunity was here, she wasn't sure how to feel. Would it make a difference? Could she ever forget the embarrassment she had felt when she was sent home, especially when she had done nothing wrong? Tasha sat in the office with her mom, waiting for Mr. Turner to arrive. She wasn't sure what to expect from him. She had never seen him like this before. He had always been confident and in control, but now, after everything that had happened, she wondered if he was feeling just as nervous as she was. When Mr. Turner entered the room, Tasha looked up. He didn't seem like the same teacher who had sent her home the day before. His usual confident demeanor was gone. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and he looked genuinely uneasy as he walked toward them. There was a quiet sincerity in his eyes as he looked at Tasha and her mom. "Hello, Tasha," he said, his voice soft. "I'm really glad we could meet today." Tasha didn't know what to say at first. She had been so upset the day before, and it wasn't easy to just move past it. But seeing the sincerity in Mr. Turner's face made her pause. He wasn't the enemy here. He had just made a mistake, like anyone could. It didn't change what had happened, but it did give her a chance to understand that maybe he wasn't the person she had assumed him to be. "I'm sorry for what happened," Mr. Turner continued, his voice steady. "I acted too quickly, and I didn't take into account how it would affect you. I see now that I made a mistake, and I regret how I handled it." Tasha listened closely, her arms crossed, still uncertain. She didn't want to make it too easy for him, but she also wasn't looking for a long, drawn-out confrontation. She just wanted to hear that he understood what he had done wrong, and that he wouldn't make the same mistake again. "I didn't mean to make you feel bad, Tasha," Mr. Turner added. "That was never my intention. I'm a teacher, and my job is to help students, not to embarrass them. I hope you know that." Tasha could feel the tension in her chest begin to loosen. She nodded slowly, processing his words. "I understand," she said quietly. "But it still felt wrong. I didn't do anything wrong, and I didn't deserve to be treated like that." "I know," Mr. Turner replied, looking down at his hands for a moment. "And I can only imagine how it felt. I promise I'll be more careful in the future. I've learned from this, and I won't make the same mistake again." Sandra, who had been watching the interaction closely, finally spoke up. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. I appreciate your apology. But more than that, I appreciate that you're taking responsibility and learning from it. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to own up to them and try to make things better." Mr. Turner nodded gratefully. "Thank you for understanding. I'll make sure to be more mindful of how I treat my students moving forward." Tasha sat there, feeling a little lighter. She wasn't sure that everything would go back to normal immediately, but hearing Mr. Turner's apology did help her feel better. It didn't erase the hurt, but it did show her that people could learn from their mistakes and that it was okay to forgive. The meeting ended on a positive note. Mr. Turner left the room, looking relieved, and Tasha and Sandra followed him out. As they walked to the car, Tasha turned to her mom. "I'm glad he apologized," she said softly. "I think it'll make things better, but it's going to take some time." Sandra smiled and hugged her daughter. "I'm proud of you for handling it with so much maturity. We all make mistakes, but it's important to learn from them and move forward." Tasha nodded, feeling the weight of the whole situation lift a little bit more. She knew that she had learned something important too. That standing up for yourself wasn't always easy, but it was worth it in the end. In the days that followed, things at school began to settle back into a routine. Tasha still felt a little uneasy when she saw Mr. Turner, but she noticed he was making an effort to be more approachable. He smiled at her when they passed in the hallways, and she could see that he was trying to be more understanding. It wasn't like everything was magically fixed, but there was a sense that things were heading in the right direction. The first few times she sat down in his class again, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching. She worried that her classmates might have heard about the incident and were judging her. But as time went on, she realized that they were more interested in their own lives than in what had happened with her. Tasha was starting to feel like she was just another student again, and that was a relief. One day after school, Sandra sat down with Tasha to talk about how everything had played out. "I'm really proud of how you handled the whole situation," Sandra said, her voice warm. "It wasn't easy, but you didn't back down when something was wrong. You stood up for yourself, and that takes a lot of strength." Tasha smiled faintly. "It wasn't easy. At first, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to make it worse, but I knew I couldn't just let it go." She thought back to the day Mr. Turner had sent her home. The feeling of humiliation and confusion had stayed with her for a long time, and it was hard to forget. "I'm glad you didn't let it slide," Sandra continued. "A lot of people might have just accepted it, but you made sure your voice was heard. And that's something important. People need to be held accountable when they make mistakes." Tasha nodded, feeling her mom's pride in her words. "I'm still kind of nervous around Mr. Turner," she admitted. "I don't know if things will ever feel completely normal again." Sandra reached out and took Tasha's hand. "It's okay to feel that way," she said softly. "But remember, it's not about forgetting. It's about understanding, growing, and moving forward. You did what was right, and sometimes that's all you can do." Over the next few weeks, Tasha noticed a change in how the teachers interacted with her. They were more considerate and made sure to check in with her every now and then. She felt like her voice mattered, like she had the right to speak up when something wasn't right. The incident with Mr. Turner had taught her more than just how to stand up for herself. It had taught her the importance of respect, understanding, and fairness in every part of life. And then, one afternoon, as she was walking home from school, Tasha caught sight of Mr. Turner standing by his classroom door. He waved at her, and this time, instead of the awkwardness she had felt before, she waved back with a small smile. It wasn't a big gesture, but it was a sign that things were healing. When she got home that day, Tasha walked straight up to her mom and said, "You were right, Mom. I think things are going to be okay." Sandra smiled, giving her daughter a hug. "I'm so glad to hear that. But remember, you're stronger than you think, and nothing can take that away from you." As Tasha sat down to do her homework that evening, she realized just how far she had come. She had been faced with something uncomfortable, something that had made her question her place at school. But in the end, it was that very challenge that had shown her how much strength she truly had inside. She wasn't just a student. She was someone who could handle whatever came her way. And no matter what happened in the future, she knew that she would always have the courage to stand up for herself and what was right.